Hello, I'm Chris Slisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore concepts that allow us to broaden our view of the world. You'll hear interesting topics, meet fascinating guests, and discover who you really are. Using the time-tested practices of astrology, you'll learn how to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Astrology, art, and spiritual adventure on Turning of the Wheel TV with Chris Slisher. Hello and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name's Chris Slisher and we're going to be talking about astrology again today. And today, as you know, I've been going through all of the planets in our local solar system in an effort to educate you. And when you know the characteristics of the planet and you combine it with the sign, then you have an aspect that gives you a sense of a character trait. That's why astrology is so valuable. So what I'm going to do today is discuss the great planet of Jupiter. And Jupiter is the planet that's right behind my head over here. It's the big planet with the big red eye in the bottom, and it is one of the most predominant planets in the solar system. Before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about the idea of when I say that why is Jupiter important to you, for example? You're like, I don't care about Jupiter. I know what my sun sign is. I know where my moon is. I know where my ascendant is, perhaps. Those are 3 points of astrology that are important. But every person is a composite of many different signs and many different planets, all the signs and all the planets, because when we cast an astrology chart, Jupiter is going to fall someplace into that chart someplace, and it's going to fall in a sign. And certain generations, Jupiter remains in a sign for roughly about 1 year. So anybody born during a particular year, those of you who are all born during the same year, are going to share Jupiter in a sign of that time. And this is a generational thing. It takes Jupiter about 12 years to cycle through all of the 12 signs of the zodiac. And while it's in your sign, it's typically a pretty darn good thing. Now Jupiter is known as, it's the sort of the beginning of what we call the outer planets. The outer planets typically start from Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Those are the outer planets. The inner planets are, obviously the Sun and the Moon, Mercury, Venus, and Mars. We've talked about those already. But today we're talking about Jupiter. It's called the great optimist, the great expansion, the great abundant player of the zodiac. And in that capacity, it's very optimistic, it's very buoyant, it tends to bring good fortune. Oftentimes people will find, people who have, say, for example, a strongly placed Jupiter in their 10th house, which is the house of career, typically do really well in their careers. They have sort of the golden touch when it comes to careers. People who have a Jupiter in their 2nd house, which is the house of money, and I'll get into the houses later on down the road, that's also very auspicious. Or sometimes people have it in their 8th house, which can be the house of inheritance. So where Jupiter is in your chart is unique to you. Not so much people born, also people born around your same time, but it is unique to you as opposed to somebody else because it only stays in one sign for a short period of time. And then every 12 years, as Jupiter circles around the zodiac, it comes back to the spot where we have what's called a Jupiter return. A Jupiter return in your chart is a very auspicious time to do things and to have things come your way. It's very auspicious, either that or when it's in a harmonious angle to any part of your chart as well. So, interesting story. Recently, I met someone who is who had a Jupiter return, and she was wondering what was going on in her life and when things were going to happen. And she had a string of fantastic events happen to her, all of which were abundant and bountiful. Now, Jupiter tends to be that. That is what is historically known as, that is what it is symbolically known as. It's known as the great beneficent. And as a result, the benefactor is another good word for it too. It's optimistic, it's abundant, it shows promise, it shows a sort of sense of spiritual prophecy as well. It's got this great sort of overarching quality to it. It's the sign that it ruled by the sign Sagittarius, which has that sweeping arc of influence, the great traveler, the great spiritual leader, and the great spiritual teacher. Those are all very Sagittarian qualities, and they're associated with Jupiter. Also known as in the 9th house, which we'll get into the houses as we get down the road further. But Jupiter has these wonderful characters about it, but it also, I want to caution you that it does, here's the big killer, big kinker, it does have a possibility to amplify. It doesn't always bring goodness. If it's poorly aspected, and we'll get into that later, if it's poorly aspected, it will not bring necessarily good fortune. It'll just bring bigger problems sometimes. So it can amplify areas of stress in your chart. But generally speaking, I use that word very cautiously, but generally speaking, Jupiter is the planet that brings optimism and abundance to the individual. We all have it in different parts of our lives. And as I said, it's based on the generational or the year in which you're born. In Chinese astrology, they have a wonderful return of the Jupiter comes back every 12 years. When that does that 5 times, it returns right back to the exact spot where it was at your time. So every 12 years, Jupiter goes around the whole zodiac wheel. When it does that 5 times, it comes right back to the spot where it was when you were born. That's called the Jupiter return at age 60 typically. So it's a fascinating time and planet in the chart, and every one of us has that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through Jupiter in the various signs so you get an idea of what it's going to be looking like in that area. So let's start out with Aries. Jupiter in Aries is a very, Aries tends to be impulsive, quick thinking, sort of, very quick to act, very much of a leader, very much of a, trendsetter. And so when you combine Jupiter with that, you might see somebody who's very much or very oriented in that way. Big personality, sort of an impulsiveness to them, a sort of and depending upon the house that it's in, it would color that character even further. So we'd tend to find that to be very much of a situation where it amplifies the characteristics of the sign that it's in. So this is very much the case when we move on to Taurus. When we see Jupiter in Taurus, we see this sense of that great earthbound quality that Taurus brings to the world, and it's also that great stubborn quality that it brings to the world as well. So we have a characteristic of both of those inherent in that time with that question of that Taurus quality. Taurus is an earth sign, as we know, and so therefore it has a sense of, sort of stability to it, rich character, an abundance of all things that are Taurian, and things that are Taurian are, love of luxury and the material goods, good food, good wine, good chocolate. All those wonderful things are very, very strong Taurus qualities. So when you put Jupiter in that capacity, you're going to see an abundance of characteristics that happen around that, and you'll see an amplification in that case. Also, we may see an amplification of the stubbornness. That's just something else to be concerned with, or to be mindful of at least. So what we see, whenever we see Jupiter in a sign, that is what we see amplified in that sign. Jupiter in Gemini would be a person who did a great job, who was very excelled perhaps at the world of communication. Someone who spoke very well, was able to teach a class, someone who was able to use words as a viable tool. And again, we get to get back into the house that it's in, because that does matter. And that's what is particular to your chart. As your chart is situated, you get the granularity that says this is where you shine, this is where your Jupiter is, this is where it shines for you. But when we see Jupiter in Gemini, we see a generation of people who are very much communicative. That for that year that it's there, it's a very communicative set of people who are working closely in the world of communication, broadcasting, writing, blogs, internet, websites. All those things are very Gemini-like, and so therefore Jupiter would be very abundant in those kinds of areas. There'd be more of a tendency towards more of a tendency to be looking at those kinds of activities, and those kinds of fields would be where we'd see it. Also, we move on to the next planet, Cancer. Jupiter is what's called exalted in Cancer. It means it's really happy there. And what that indicates is an ability to be maternal, all the things that are very Cancerian in astrology, the things about the mother, the maternity, the source of comfort, the home, the very strong sensitivity. All those characteristics are amplified when we find that Jupiter is in that part of the chart. It's a very strong characteristic of what we find there. Then we move on to Leo. Leo's interesting because Leo is already a bold, proud sign to begin with. When we combine Jupiter with Leo, we get amplified personality perhaps. We might see someone who's very, very vocal, very abundant, very effusive, very confident. Jupiter tends to bring confidence and buoyancy. When we think of it, we think of the best word is really optimistic, very much optimistic. Very much the case with Leo. We'd see that strong creative urge, that wonderful sense of taking charge, sort of taking the world by the reins, and really being able to work its way through very, very successfully. When we move on to Virgo, Jupiter in Virgo is amplified in this regard as well. It would indicate a person who's very good with daily work, sort of figures, facts, details. Virgo is known for their detail-oriented characteristics. They're very precise. They have a very good sense of propriety and what's right and what's wrong. And as a result, they're very good in the medical field. So we find a lot of doctors and nurses and dental technicians have this strong Virgo characteristic. Anybody who does service. So when you see Jupiter in this case, we're going to see that amplified. Again, that characteristic will be amplified. And of course, it matters where this lands in your chart in particular, because it's going to color the way Jupiter is manifested in your personal life. It's really very critical about that. The next planet down the line after Jupiter, after Virgo rather, is Libra. Now Jupiter in Libra is an interesting characteristic because it gives that wonderful sense, that a strong aesthetic quality that we see so strongly in Libra. Libra is very much about that aesthetic eye, that great, wonderful eye for perfection, that sense of beauty, that embracing of color and texture. All of those things would be very, very key with Jupiter in that particular part of the chart, if you had Jupiter in Libra. It's also known for being very well balanced. So there'd be this great sense of equanimity, that sense of trying to make things balanced and being able to see both sides and being fair. So oftentimes we'll find people who have a Jupiter in Libra might be a judge or a lawyer, someone who's able to have that intellectual discussion and see both sides of the story. That's very much the case with Jupiter. We move on to Jupiter in Scorpio, and we have a person who has a real drive and an abundance of ability to dig beneath the covers, to sort of this research quality. We see this characteristic of sort of the ability to dig beneath the covers, as sort of the secretive quality. A lot of those characteristics are amplified in that capacity. When we move on to Sagittarius, this is the sign that rules Jupiter. And Jupiter rules the sign. So there's a mutual beneficial relationship between the two. And in Jupiter and Sagittarius is very much of this is where it really shines the best. It's sort of the opportunistic, optimist, the glad-handing person. Sometimes we'll find a politician with this because they have that great worldwide sort of view and they love to travel and they have this. And we often find it in teachers as well. People who have a strong Jupiter in Sagittarius are known for their teaching, and they're known for their ability to be spiritual. They're very sort of ethereal kind of cerebral quality is there. I think that's the best word to describe it. Next, we move on to Jupiter in Capricorn. Jupiter in Capricorn is also, again, it's an earth sign. It's a very foundational, it's a cardinal earth sign. So it's where you might see someone beginning things. This is a very strong pioneering sign that has a great sense of starting and beginning. All those characteristics are very true. And also, you'd find people who are very good at large organizational characteristics. We have things such as banks and universities and buildings, architects and people who do a lot of work with actually physically building things are known for being strong Capricornians, outdoor, earth-oriented characteristics. And when we find Jupiter there, we find this sense of optimism and sort of a can-do attitude, I think is the best way to say it. We move on to Aquarius. Aquarius, as we know, is a global reaching sort of community-oriented sign. It's very much altruistic. We find a lot of people who are involved with charities there. So organizations and people who have a Jupiter there would see an abundance of that quality. People who really want to reach out. People who are the compassionate ones in the world. Those that want to express themselves in community ways. It's not about being self-centered. It's not really so much about the self as it is about moving the dreams and the wishes and the goals of the community or the organization forward. That's what Jupiter in this regard would be very much the case. Now, finally, we move on to Jupiter in Pisces, and we see the great dreamer come to light. We see this great sort of amplified dreamer. This is the person who spends a lot of time in fantasy worlds, not necessarily in a bad way, but just one who finds themselves able to escape, able to move on, able to do things in new ways, able to sort of stretch that sense of fantasy and character a little bit further. So we'd see that big amplifying quality there. So that's through the signs, Jupiter and the signs. And as I said, Jupiter spends about a year in each of those signs each year. So every year it goes by, every 12 years, you're going to have Jupiter in your sign. When you have Jupiter in your sign at the ages of 12, 24, 36, 48, and so on, 60 and 72, you're going to find that those are years that are especially good for your career or wherever they land. And I'm going to go through the houses next. When they land in that house, and that house is oriented, the houses in the chart are the stage settings where the action takes place. It's very much like walking into a play where you're in a different scene, a different stage setting. So it's important to understand that. When you know your exact birth date, place, and time, most importantly, the astrologer, myself perhaps, can set your wheel accordingly, and then you'll see which house Jupiter lands in, and you'll see an actual attraction and an abundance of character in that part of your chart. Now, Jupiter in the first house is about ego. So we're going to see Jupiter there being very much of a confident, large person. This has a real sort of like Aryan-like quality, as I mentioned earlier, because it's the first house. The first house is the house of Aries. But depending upon what that first house is, it gives a person a sense of confidence, a presence in the room. You can feel that presence. There's a sense of largesse there. It can also be overwhelming, though, as well. So we don't want to, everything, remember, the word amplification is very critical. You know, things tend to get amplified when they're dealing with Jupiter in that place of the house. The first house is the house of ego. We could see an amplified ego there, someone who has a very strong ego. And when the Jupiter returns to that spot every 12 years, that ego would be really amplified. As I mentioned earlier, the second house is a favorite house of many people because it's the house of money and possessions. So when Jupiter lands in your second house, it tends to mean that you do pretty well with regard to money and possessions. Either you acquire them through hard work and you're very good at that, or you have good luck with financial planning and stuff like that. Also, sometimes there may be an inheritance, or money seems to come your way quite easily. Many people want to know if this is the case, and if it is the case, they generally know, and they don't have to really look too hard to find it. What's most important is that they understand that when it's there, it has that same quality to amplify. So someone might be a little bit too aggressive with their finances and overinvest in some ways. That's another way of looking at that characteristic. When we move on to the third house, that's the house of communication and siblings. So if you have Jupiter in your third house, you might have an ability to be someone who gets behind the camera. Not that I do, my Jupiter's not there, but this is the type of person you would find there. Someone who does broadcasting, someone who does writing, someone who has a lot of interaction with siblings, their particular sibling families, or also who does a lot of research. This is where you'd find that amplified characteristic and abundance. Amplification also means this could be a person who speaks too much, speaks too loudly, whatever. So there's that amplification quality I want to remind you of. Next, we move on to the fourth house. The fourth house is the house of home and family. And this is the central place. Where you have Jupiter in your fourth house, you typically have a thriving, healthy, happy home. And that means that the interrelationships between the members of the family are typically good. You live in a safe area, you have a nice accoutrements, your house is nice. You tend to see that wonderful sense of security, I guess is the best word. Security is a very good word for the Cancer part of your life because it means home, and home means comfort, and it might be a strong maternal bond as well there when Jupiter is there. We move on to Jupiter in the fifth house. Jupiter in the fifth house is the house of children, it's the house of fun, it's the house of creativity. Who doesn't love all that? So when we have Jupiter there, we will find an abundance of creativity. Perhaps the person is a very strong artist or very motivated toward artists, or they could be someone who has a lot of children. They could be someone who is especially prone to partying, having a good time, and also has that sense of fun and gaiety about themselves. It's a real sense of, childlike enthusiasm is what I best think it works for that word. Very much the case in that regard. When we move into Jupiter in the sixth house is the house of daily work, it's the house of health, and it's a place where if you have Jupiter there, you tend to be a very good employee. You're someone who shows up and you're very responsible, you do your work, you have a great eye for detail, you have the ability to be precise and also very much of a service-oriented type of person. I want to remind you, though, that again, Amplification, what does that mean? The person who's there might be overly controlling sometimes. They may have overly self-conscious about their health and their daily work as well. So those are things to keep in mind when you're talking about that. And that's what you can find out with a professional astrology reading if you want. When we move on to the seventh house is the house of romance. It's the house of relationships. So everybody loves that as well. We all want to know. Most astrologers, such as myself, the most common question we get is, where's the love and where's the money? And so if you have Jupiter in your seventh house, you're bound to be, at some point in your life, having a very significant relationship that probably goes very well. Or at least it's going to be incredibly important. Again, there's that word amplify. If that person comes into your life and amplifies that area of your life, you're going to be finding that that could be also just as, it can also be a problem depending upon how it's aspected, and we'll get into that in a later episode. But Jupiter there tends to bring this sense of optimism and abundance and this real sense of buoyancy, and maybe sometimes missed expectations or unachievable expectations. Their expectations aren't set properly, because that's always that, sort of that sense of largesse that we find. Also, when we're talking about, now we're moving on to the eighth house. Jupiter in the eighth house is a person who is known for their spirituality and their sense, and also the presence of death. And of course, the eighth house is the house of regeneration. So regeneration typically means sex and death. Those are two wide ends of the spectrum, but those are the sort of the extremes that we're talking about here. When we see Jupiter in this area, we tend to find people who have had an inordinate amount of death in their lives, relatives, friends, family, whatever, unfortunately. Also, the ability to inherit as a result of some of those deaths, and also a strong spiritual connection, because the eighth house is about spirituality and that sense of curiosity in that regard. So you might find someone with a very strong tendency towards that. When we go to the next house, which is the ninth house, Jupiter in the ninth house, this is the house that it rules. It's the ninth house, which is also governed by Sagittarius, represented in the general chart. And when we see Jupiter in this particular case, we find this ability to teach, to travel, to expand the mind in any way possible. There's this, there's an ability, they just want to get up and get going. The world is too small to contain them in many ways. They just want to get out and push and see what there is out there in the world. And it's very important that you understand where your Jupiter is if you're there, because you can really do quite a bit with it. You'll find teachers there, people who have a great sense of responsibility with that characteristic. There's a strong push towards that. So it's something to keep in mind. The next house is the 10th house, as I mentioned earlier. The 10th house is the house of career. Now, the house of career is also the house of occupation. So most people think of occupation as a career, but if you're a student, your occupation is going to school. If you're a mother staying home with her children, your occupation is staying home taking care of children, or if you're a father staying home taking care of children. It works both ways. But when it's in the 10th house, when Jupiter lands in the 10th house, we tend to see an importance of the career and success in the career as well. It's an area where people really can sort of have that Midas touch, so to speak, because there's always this wonderful optimism, and people tend to assign these people, they love having them in the office because they're optimistic. They are the real go-getters. They tend to have a good mind for marketing if they're in such a field, and they just have a great sense of getting things done because there's this, and there's overachievement in some cases. Now that brings up the other side of the coin. Again, the amplification. It could mean that you're spending too much time at work. You could be the person who is sort of consumed by work and everything that entails. And so it's important to sort of be able to understand that. And knowing these pieces of the chart and the individual is very critical to understanding your people in your life when you know where these planets are placed. The next house is the 11th house, and the 11th house is interesting because it's the house of associations. This is where your friendships are. This is where your book clubs are, your golf buddies, your people who you hang out with at work, the sort of the team that you're on at your office or whatever you're working on. This is where you would find that harmonious angle happening, and you'd find an inordinate amount of people who had this characteristic in their chart. You'd find them to be very much involved with a lot of civic groups, a lot of organizations, and there'd be an abundance of them because that's sort of that, again, that amplifying characteristic that comes through, that big, bold, amplifying process that comes as a result of having Jupiter in that part of your life. Good for friendships, good for coworkers, good for teamwork. And finally, we come to the house of the 12th house, which is the house of transition. House of transition is always scary to people because they think of transition as an ending. Well, yes, it is an ending for sure, but we all know, as I've said in the past, that endings are also marvelous times for beginnings. So people who have this may be very spiritually inclined. They may be very much involved with the process of the mind and the subconscious in some way, because it's very much of a Neptunian era. It has that characteristic, the 12th house Pisces, which is ruled by Neptune. So there's that amplified process there. We might see somebody who is very much involved with helping people to transition. So that's an interesting piece as well. There's a lot of things about Jupiter, and you have to take Jupiter as one of many planets. It's a family member of a very large family that runs from the Sun all the way out to Pluto. So each of those planets has a characteristic and is important to you as an individual. So it's important that you understand that. And when you understand that, you can very well operate accordingly. This is what's important, is when you're best prepared, you are best informed. When you're best informed, you're best prepared. It works both ways. So it's important to understand that. I'm going to read a passage out of a book that I look all the time to because it's a great source of inspiration, but it's going to give a pretty good summary of Jupiter. I'm going to read it to you now. It's very quick, and it'll be a great way to sort of summarize the characteristics of Jupiter and why Jupiter is so important in your chart, okay? Although Jupiter is a planet of growth, its function extends far beyond the capacity to accumulate raw materials, such as perhaps the moon might do, and to arrange them in pleasing patterns, in the manner of what we might see with Venus. Jupiter coordinates assimilated personal and interpersonal experience of the moon and the Venus together. So there's that strong aesthetic quality. The moon is emotions and Venus is our sense of love. So we find that connection there. The moon represents the masses and Venus represents society. But Jupiter represents the collective order which determines the behavior of aggregates of individuals, groups of individuals. The moon signifies simple quantity, Venus adds quality, and Jupiter is mindful of the deeper implication of that which has been wrought. Since this far-seeing planet operates within the confines of convention, its expansiveness is generally contained within the bounds of propriety. Now, the reason I read that was because I wanted to give you an overarching idea of what that is in particular. When we find this characteristic, we know that it is something that has to be dealt with, and we find ourselves perhaps even reaching too far. This is the downside of Jupiter. We can reach too far, and there are ways of reining that in. Oftentimes, if we have what's considered to be a pleasant interplay between, say, certain planets and Jupiter, we're going to see very positive outcomes. If we see difficult aspects, relationships between them, we're going to find difficult outcomes. But the most important part is to understand where your Jupiter is. www.turningofthewheel.com is my website. You can go there and you can get a sample reading by contacting me. I can run your chart and tell you exactly where the Jupiter is in your chart, and this will allow you to find your personal sense of satisfaction. This is where you can find areas of expansion. You probably even know that this is an area, but it's easily identified, which is one of the wonderful, fascinating things about astrology. We see this ability to see the character traits so clearly evident. www.turningofthewheel.com. Turningofthewheel.com is one long word. You can see it on the screen there at some point in time. And it gives, Jupiter is the topic of the day here, and Jupiter is the great abundance. It's the great beneficiary, the great benevolent. It's the where we find expansion, we find this sense of optimism, and it's one of the best planets in the chart, and you need to know where it is. And I'll talk to you all again.